This team lists on its roster some of the slowest and worst shooters ever to play in the NBA. No, those aren't my words. That is a direct quote from a 1964 Sports Illustrated article. And if you don't trust the journalistic work from people that witness this atrocity of a team, here is a quote from the head coach of the San Francisco Warriors. I realized how completely inadequate the team had become. They were even incapable of beating a squad of rookies. That was the team that Wilt Chamberlain was stuck with in the 1963-64 season, and he carried them all the way to the finals. How was he able to do this? Did he average 50 points per game like he did in 1962? Believe it or not, his scoring production decreased by a lot, but he found the secret to success that allowed him to have one of the greatest individual seasons in NBA history. Before we get to that, let's first look at the context. What led the Warriors to be in such bad shape? It all started in the 1962 offseason. The Warriors had just finished a bittersweet ending to their year. They were only one game away from reaching the finals after losing to the Boston Celtics in the final moments of Game 7. At that point in time, the Warriors were located in Philadelphia, but then the team was sold and moved to San Francisco. This was a major move, and not all of the players on the team could afford to move their families out west. So that caused the Warriors' second leading scorer, Paul Arizin, to retire. Then their third leading scorer, Tom Gola, was asked to be traded to an Eastern Conference team. Now all of a sudden, Wilt was stuck with a team that was dreadful on offense. It seemed like the only way that the Warriors could remain competitive was for Wilt to win games by himself. And I mean that in the most literal sense. That led him to have a monster individual season. He averaged 44.8 points per game. Even with that stat line, the Warriors failed to reach the playoffs. They ended the season with a 31-49 record. Not even the greatness of Chamberlain was enough to salvage this team. After that disappointing season, do you know what the Warriors did to improve their roster? Absolutely nothing, which makes sense because they had no intriguing assets. Why would any team want to do business with them unless they were shopping Wilt? This was the exact same team that finished with the third worst record. So at the start of the season, Sports Illustrated wrote that they were the obvious choice to finish with one of the worst records in the NBA. They just didn't have enough talent to give Wilt any kind of help on the offensive end. To have a better idea of this, let's take a brief look at the top 3 scoring options the Warriors had. Their second leading scorer was Tom Meschery. The first word that Sports Illustrated used to describe this player back in 2017 was that he was tall. That's never a great sign. Other than his height, he was also known for being a tough and passionate player. Those are great qualities to have for a role player, a glue guy. But for your second scoring option, you want something a little bit more. He averaged 13.5 points for the season. Right behind him was Wayne Hightower. In the previous year, the Philadelphia Daily News sports writer Jack Kaiser called him the biggest disappointment to hit the NBA in years. So there's that. Although the New York Times also described him as a tenacious rebounder, scoring wasn't his thing. That explains why he only averaged 13.2 points on 38% shooting. Last but not least, there was Guy Rodgers. I'm not about to disrespect this Hall of Famer. He was one of the best floor generals in the NBA. He was a high IQ player, and he knew how to pass it to Wilt even when he had multiple players guarding him. He was responsible for a lot of the points he scored. He was legitimately a great point guard. But again, scoring wasn't his strong suit. He averaged 11 points on 36% shooting. With that context in mind, how was Wilt able to turn this team around? Although they made no significant changes to their roster, they did add a valuable piece. They hired head coach Alex Hannum. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he was the coach for the 1967 Philadelphia 76ers, which was the team where Wilt won his first championship. They had the most dominant season in league history up to that point, in large part because he convinced Wilt that he no longer needed to be a volume scorer. That was the first time they averaged less than 30 points per game, and the Sixers were able to win a record-breaking 68 games. However, it was much easier to convince him to give the ball up when you have all-star players such as Hal Greer, Chet Walker, and Luke Jackson on your team. That wasn't the case for the 1964 San Francisco Warriors. He had every right to not trust his teammates. But to his credit, he was able to convince them to trust his teammates and to dominate the defensive end as he does on offense. Here was the type of season that Wilt had. He averaged 36.9 points on 52% shooting, 22.3 rebounds, and 5 assists per game. He went from averaging 2.4 assists in 1962 to doubling that total 2 years later. He was a much more willing passer, and that helped uplift the energy level that his teammates played with. But their biggest improvement came on the defensive end. They went from finishing dead last in opponents' points per game and having the 4th worst defensive rating to finishing 1st in opponents' points per game and 2nd in defensive rating. Wilt was the reason behind their dominant defense. He earned a 10.6 defensive win shares, which is the 8th highest mark for a single season. That was the key to their success. Of course, his willingness to pass the ball gave his team a whole new outlook. But if you look at the numbers, they finished last in points and 3rd to last in offensive rating. Their biggest strength was defense, and that is where he made his biggest impact. It was truly Russell-esque. The main difference is that Bill Russell could never dream of putting up the numbers that Wilt was recording. For example, there were 9 games where he scored over 50 points. There were also 2 games where he recorded a 40-point triple-double. The end result was that the Warriors increased their win total by 17 games. They finished with 48 wins and the 3rd best record in the league. He also earned a mind-blowing 25 win shares for the season, which is the 2nd highest mark ever. I believe this is one of his greatest accomplishments. He single-handedly turned this laughingstock of a team into a championship contender. How he didn't win the MVP that year just blows my mind. As great as Oscar Robertson was, it just doesn't compare to the degree of difficulty of Wilt's season. But the question remained, could he carry this team to the finals? They had to go through a tough St. Louis Hawks team led by Bob Pettit and Lenny Wilkens. They also had depth. They had Hall of Fame players such as Cliff Hagan, Zemo Beatty, and Richie Guerin. Despite all the weapons they had, the Warriors kept the series competitive. They were tied at 2 apiece, and Wilt had one of the greatest performances of his playoff career. In Game 5, he went for 50 points on 69% shooting, 15 rebounds, and 6 assists. After losing in Game 6, it all came down to the deciding Game 7. This was going to determine who was going to play the Boston Celtics in the finals. During this time, Wilt was being criticized for not coming through in pressure games. They would usually bring up his performance in the 1962 series against Boston. In Game 7, he scored 22 points on 15 shot attempts. This was the same player that averaged 50 points on nearly 40 shot attempts that season. No one could understand why he wasn't more aggressive in such an important game, but he responded to his critics in a resounding way. He recorded 39 points on 66% shooting, 30 rebounds, and 6 assists. In the end, the San Francisco Warriors pulled the impossible. They went from being one of the worst teams in the NBA to reaching the finals. The sole reason for their success was Wilt Chamberlain. Take a look at the numbers for that series. He averaged nearly 40 points per game, with no other teammate averaging over 18 points. He not only carried them offensively, but his presence in the paint helped contain Bob Pettit to 42% shooting. That's a 4% drop from his regular season average. It was an incredible all-around performance from Chamberlain. In the finals, they lost in 5 games. They were simply no match for the mighty Celtics, who could neutralize Wilt much better than any other team could. But just imagine if this version of Chamberlain had a decent squad. I believe they would have taken over the league by storm. Despite coming up short from reaching the ultimate goal, this doesn't take away from what he accomplished in this forgone season. In my opinion, it's one of the 10 greatest seasons in NBA history. In my latest book, where I rate the top 300 regular seasons by a player, I had it ranked 8th all time. Where would you have this ranked? Do you believe this should be considered Wilt's greatest season? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.